Disrespect rarely enters a room announcing itself. It does not arrive with raised voices or obvious hostility. More often, it slips in quietly, dressed as humor, softened by smiles, and carried on the assumption that no one present would dare to take it seriously. In moments like these, the room feels safe, familiar, almost warm, and that is precisely why what happens next is so easy to overlook. People tend to believe that harm must look dramatic to be real. They expect tension, confrontation, or at least visible discomfort. But some of the most lasting wounds are delivered in places where laughter is expected and civility is taken for granted. They occur in rooms where everyone assumes goodwill, and no one pauses long enough to question how easily dignity can be reduced without resistance. On the surface, nothing appears wrong. The air feels light. Conversations move easily. The setting suggests trust, not danger. Papers lie neatly arranged, evidence of preparation and order. Chairs are placed close enough to suggest familiarity, but not closeness. Everything about the environment communicates normalcy, safety, continuity. It is the kind of place where people believe nothing important can be lost. What most people miss in moments like these is not the action itself, but the permission it creates. When a joke lands and no one objects, it quietly resets the boundaries of what is acceptable. When laughter follows instead of reflection, it teaches everyone present that dignity is optional, that respect can be negotiated away without consequence. The absence of objection becomes an unspoken agreement. Humor is powerful precisely because it deflects responsibility. It invites participation without accountability. Anyone who reacts risks appearing sensitive, difficult, or unwilling to take a joke. Silence, on the other hand, keeps the room comfortable. It allows the moment to pass without friction. And so silence is often chosen, not because nothing was felt, but because something was understood. In families especially, this dynamic becomes normalized quickly. Familiarity breeds confidence, and confidence allows small dismissals to hide in plain sight. A comment framed as playful carries more weight than anyone admits because it arrives from someone trusted. The harm is not in the words alone, but in the collective agreement to treat them as harmless. What makes these moments dangerous is not their intensity, but their efficiency. They pass quickly. They leave no visible mark. They require no follow-up. By the time anyone considers whether something felt wrong, the room has already moved on. Conversations shift. Smiles return. The moment is filed away as inconsequential. Yet something has changed. The shift is subtle, almost imperceptible. It does not alter the atmosphere enough to be named. It settles instead into posture, into the way someone holds themselves afterward, into the space they occupy without comment. It teaches a quiet lesson about who is allowed to be diminished and how easily it can happen without consequence. Most people in the room will forget the moment entirely. They will remember the gathering as pleasant, even enjoyable. They will recall laughter, not its cost. This forgetting is not malicious. It is structural. It allows relationships and systems to continue without disruption. Forgetting becomes the mechanism that protects comfort. But forgetting is never universal. There is often someone present who does not experience the moment as finished. Someone who notices how quickly the room recovers, how easily concern is expressed without responsibility, how silence is interpreted as agreement. This person does not react outwardly. They do not interrupt or correct. They simply observe, storing details that others discard. This is how memory begins its work. It starts not with outrage, but with attention. It begins by noticing timing, tone, and the absence of acknowledgement. It recognizes that dignity was compromised not through force, but through familiarity. And it understands, even without language, that what just occurred was not harmless simply because it was quiet. In these moments, something important is decided. Either the event disappears entirely, absorbed into routine, or it lingers in the awareness of the one who noticed. That awareness does not demand action immediately. It does not rush toward resolution. It waits, gathering context, learning patience, understanding that reaction is not always power. What follows from such moments is rarely immediate. There are no dramatic consequences, no instant reckonings. Life continues. Routines resume. The room empties. On the surface, nothing has changed. But beneath that surface, a line has been crossed, and someone has seen it happen. That person may not yet understand the significance of what they witnessed. They may not know how or when it will matter, but they carry it forward nonetheless, quietly, intact. Because while laughter fades quickly, memory does not. And when disrespect is disguised as humor, it is never the laughter that defines the moment. It is the one who does not forget. Silence does not appear threatening to most adults. It presents itself as order, composure, and control. It signals that a situation has been handled, that emotions have been contained, and that life can move forward without disruption. To adults, silence often feels like maturity. It feels like resolution. But to a child, silence feels unfinished, like a story that stops before its meaning is explained. Even after words disappear, silence continues to linger, asking questions no one answers. The grandson sensed this immediately, though he lacked the language to explain it. Something had passed through the room that did not belong there, and while everyone else returned easily to conversation, he remained aware of a subtle imbalance. Nothing dramatic had occurred, yet something felt off. The feeling was quiet but persistent, following him long after the moment ended. The adults assumed he did not understand. That assumption shaped everything that followed. No one softened their tone because of him. No one clarified what had been said or reconsidered how it might have sounded. The adults believed children absorbed only fragments of adult behavior, missing the nuance that gave it meaning. In reality, he absorbed almost everything except the explanations, because none were offered. In the days that followed, he watched his grandmother closely. She did not change in ways that invited concern. Her routines remained intact, almost reassuring in their consistency. She woke early, organized her paperwork, and moved through daily tasks with the same quiet care she always had. There were no visible signs of hurt or bitterness. She did not ask for comfort or seek validation. To anyone watching casually, she appeared untouched by what had happened. What stood out to the grandson was not what she did differently, but what she refused to do at all. She did not mention the moment. She did not revisit it or frame it as something that required attention. There was no complaint, no quiet aside meant to invite sympathy, no shared look asking to be understood. The silence around the event felt deliberate, not accidental, as though she had already decided which moments deserve her voice and which did not. The family followed her lead without discussion. Conversations continued smoothly, untouched by reference to the past. The joke was never mentioned again, not because it had been resolved, but because it had been quietly set aside. Adults spoke around it with ease, filling the space with safer topics. The grandson noticed how quickly silence became collective, how easily everyone agreed to move forward without naming what had been left behind. There was no begging for acknowledgement, no emotional dumping passed down to him. The adults did not burden him with explanations or justify their behavior. From their perspective, this restraint protected him. From his perspective, it sharpened his awareness. Without guidance, without commentary, he was left alone with observation, and observation became his teacher. He began noticing patterns beyond his home. He saw how adults used humor to close uncomfortable conversations. He noticed how concern could be expressed without responsibility, how polite words often replaced accountability. Silence, he learned, allowed people to move forward without addressing what lingered beneath the surface. These realizations did not make him angry. They settled quietly, forming an internal record he did not yet know how to organize. His grandmother's composure became the clearest lesson of all. She showed him that restraint did not mean denial. She did not pretend the moment had not happened. She simply refused to let it define her outward behavior. Her silence carried intention. It marked boundaries that did not require explanation. Watching her, the grandson learned that strength could exist without display, that dignity did not need to announce itself to remain intact. Still, the silence confused him. He wondered whether not speaking meant forgiving, or whether forgiveness even applied. The lack of clarity pushed him to search for meaning in small details, the way his grandmother folded papers, the steadiness of her voice, the calm precision of her movements. He sensed that something had been absorbed rather than released, held rather than dismissed. As time passed, the memory did not fade the way the adults expected it to. It did not grow louder either. It remained intact, preserved without emotion, waiting. The grandson did not dwell on it consciously, but it surfaced in moments when adults laughed something away too quickly or dismissed concerns with ease. Each time, the same feeling returned, quiet and unmistakable. Something feels off. He did not confront anyone. He did not ask questions that demanded answers. Instead, he learned patience. He learned that not every wrong required immediate correction, and that some truths revealed themselves slowly. The silence surrounding that day became a lesson without instruction, teaching him how to hold awareness without forcing resolution. What he did not yet fully understand was that silence served different purposes for different people. For some, it avoided discomfort. For others, it preserved dignity. Watching his grandmother, he sensed that her silence belonged to the second kind. It protected something fragile without asking anyone else to participate. The realization came gradually, not as a conclusion, but as a shift. Silence, he began to understand, did not always signal forgiveness. Sometimes it signaled memory, carefully held, quietly maintained, waiting for a moment when it might finally matter. And in that understanding, something settled inside him, preparing him for a patience he did not yet know he would need. Time did what it always does on the surface. It moved forward steadily, smoothing edges, rearranging priorities, and convincing nearly everyone involved that what had happened no longer carried weight. The grandson grew older without ceremony, guided through school years, expectations, and the quiet pressure to become dependable. Childhood loosened its grip gradually, replaced by routines that demanded more responsibility and offered less room for reflection. From the outside, his life followed a familiar American rhythm, orderly and unremarkable in ways that suggested stability and progress. Within the family, the past settled into something unspoken and therefore manageable. Daily habits resumed their predictable pattern. Meals were shared, holidays observed, plans discussed and revised. Conversations filled themselves with new topics, newer concerns, and the ordinary details that give life continuity. The moment that had once passed through the room so lightly was never named again. It did not need to be dismissed because no one acknowledged it strongly enough to require dismissal. It became part of what was no longer discussed. The daughter never revisited it. Not once. In her understanding, the joke had ended exactly where it began. She carried no visible discomfort and no lingering hesitation. Her confidence remained intact, reinforced by the absence of resistance or correction. She moved forward without looking back, certain that nothing unresolved followed her. The ease with which she forgot became, in itself, a quiet marker of how completely the moment had been normalized. The grandmother remained as she always had. Her composure did not soften into fragility, nor did it harden into distance. She continued to live by structure, tending to her routines with the same careful attention. Her days were organized around preparation and completion, around small tasks done well and without complaint. If the past lived anywhere within her, it did not alter her outward behavior. She offered no commentary, no lessons, no warnings. Her silence remained intact, not brittle, but settled and deliberate. The grandson watched all of this from a growing distance, shaped by time, but not separated from memory. As he entered environments beyond his family, he began to notice something familiar in places he had not expected it. Classrooms, offices, and institutional settings carried the same subtle dynamics he had once observed at home. Authority presented itself with calm assurance. Dismissals were delivered politely. Smiles softened decisions that felt final without appearing cruel. At first, these similarities registered as discomfort rather than understanding. Something felt off again, in the same quiet way it had years earlier. He noticed how easily concerns were brushed aside when framed as humor or procedure. He noticed how often tone replaced accountability, how reassurance arrived without resolution. The recognition did not provoke anger. Instead, it brought a slow clarity. What he had witnessed as a child was not isolated. It was part of a larger pattern. With maturity came context. He began to understand that humiliation did not always arise from intent. Often, it emerged from systems designed to move efficiently, to avoid friction, to prioritize continuity over care. Seen this way, the past shifted. It was no longer a personal wound tied to a single moment. It became an example of something repeated quietly across different spaces, reinforced by habit and rewarded by forgetfulness. Still, he did nothing. Observation replaced reaction completely. He carried himself carefully, attentive to timing, mindful of consequence. He had learned that confronting patterns too early only taught them how to disguise themselves more effectively. The long game revealed itself not as patience for its own sake, but as respect for complexity. Watching and waiting felt more honest than interrupting without understanding. Memory matured into something steadier. It no longer demanded attention, nor did it fade. It simply informed the way he moved through the world. He noticed details others overlooked. He paid attention to how decisions were justified, how authority explained itself, how records were kept and referenced. He understood now that systems remembered selectively, relying on turnover, distraction, and silence to protect themselves. The grandmother remained present in his awareness, not as a source of unresolved pain, but as a reference point. Her restraint offered a model that grew clearer with time. She had not denied what happened. She had chosen not to perform it. That distinction mattered. It allowed dignity to remain intact without demanding acknowledgement from those unwilling to give it. As the years continued, the grandson encountered moments that mirrored the past more closely than coincidence allowed. A familiar pattern appeared, subtle but unmistakable, connected to positions of authority that operated with the same confidence he had once seen in his own family. The recognition did not surprise him. It settled instead, confirming what memory had been preparing him to see. He did not react. He did not speak. He simply noted it, allowing the pattern to reveal itself fully before deciding what it required. The watching continued, now deliberate and informed. And for the first time, he sensed that memory was no longer alone. It was moving toward a place where it might finally matter. Awareness, on its own, can be gentle but powerless. It can shape perception without ever shaping outcome, lingering quietly in the background of a life without changing its direction. The grandson understood this now in a way he had not before. Memory had given him clarity, but clarity alone did not create structure. It explained what he felt without offering a way to hold it. What he needed was something steadier, something that could carry memory forward without depending on emotion to keep it alive. That was when he turned, almost instinctively, toward documentation. There was no dramatic decision that marked this shift. No moment of resolve where he promised himself to correct the past or confront anyone connected to it. What emerged instead was a habit, formed gradually and without ceremony. He began keeping records the way some people keep journals, not to revisit experiences, but to preserve accuracy. Dates, names, revisions, approvals. Details that often appeared insignificant on their own but gained meaning when placed beside one another. Paperwork became familiar territory, not because it promised justice, but because it offered consistency. There was no revenge in this process. No emotional charge guided his attention. He did not search for wrongdoing or collect documents with the intent to expose harm. He simply noticed what repeated. Patterns appeared quietly, without effort, as timelines overlapped and language echoed itself. The same decisions justified with the same phrasing. The same procedures applied rigidly, even when circumstances differed. The repetition did not feel shocking. It felt confirming, as though the system were revealing itself simply by being allowed to continue uninterrupted. Silence remained deliberate throughout. No one knew what he was collecting, and no one needed to. He did not speak about his observations or seek reassurance that they mattered. The work was internal, guided by patience rather than urgency. He had learned that exposing patterns too early only taught systems how to disguise themselves more carefully. Documentation required time. It asked for restraint, not reaction. Paper trails revealed more than intent ever could. They showed behavior continuing uninterrupted across years, unchanged by feedback or context. He noticed how often concern appeared in writing, carefully worded and evenly applied, without ever altering outcome. The language was polite, professional, and detached, designed to sound reasonable while closing every possible door. The calmness of it all felt familiar in a way he could not ignore, echoing the tone he remembered from years earlier. What surprised him most was how protective documentation felt. Not defensive, not accusatory, protective. Each record stood on its own, complete and self-sufficient, requiring no emotional framing to be understood. Together, they formed something solid, something that did not rely on memory alone to exist. Documentation did not argue. It did not persuade. It waited. That quality gave him a sense of quiet stability he had not realized he needed. As he organized the files, he became increasingly aware of how timing shaped meaning. Documents separated by years began to speak to one another when aligned carefully. Small discrepancies surfaced, not as errors, but as indicators of repetition. The same approach resurfacing again and again, regardless of outcome. He recognized now that systems often repeated themselves because no one had taken the time to observe their patterns in full. The grandmother's presence lingered throughout this process, not as a wound but as context. Her restraint made more sense than ever. She had not lacked awareness. She had lacked a structure that would honor it. In choosing silence, she had preserved her dignity, but the system around her had continued unchanged. Documentation offered a way to hold both truths at once, without forcing either into performance or explanation. He did not feel anger as the connections became clearer. There was no surge of emotion demanding release. Instead, there was a calm acceptance that what he was seeing had always existed, waiting patiently to be assembled. The process felt almost gentle, as though memory itself had guided him towards something useful rather than burdensome. Guilt softened as understanding deepened. Grace replaced the need for urgency. One evening, while reviewing older records, he noticed a document that asked for more attention. It had been archived carefully, labeled in a way that suggested finality. The formatting was familiar, the language precise and polished. As he read, the alignment became unmistakable. The phrasing mirrored something he had carried since childhood. The justification followed the same logic, the same measured tone of concern that offered explanation without accountability. The date matched. He did not react outwardly. He did not stop or reread the page in disbelief. He simply allowed the recognition to settle, understanding its weight without dramatizing it. The document did not accuse or explain. It connected. It placed the grandmother's humiliation within a broader pattern that could no longer be dismissed as isolated or accidental. In that moment, memory shifted fully into structure. What had once lived quietly inside him now existed on paper, preserved without emotion and untouched by interpretation. It did not ask to be believed. It simply was. And he understood then that documentation had done what silence alone could not. It had made memory useful. The system moved forward with the confidence of something that had never been forced to pause and examine itself. It operated smoothly, repeating its motions with practiced ease, certain that whatever had come before no longer carried relevance. Decisions were made, procedures followed, outcomes recorded, all without any awareness that these actions might belong to a longer, connected story. The absence of resistance had taught the system a quiet lesson over time. Forgetting worked and forgetting protected it. The grandson saw this more clearly now than he ever had before. What he had first sensed as a child, then slowly recognized as an adult, revealed itself fully through repetition. The same behaviors resurfaced again and again, unchanged by context or consequence. Authority expressed itself through calm certainty, through policies delivered with professional warmth. Smiles softened rigid outcomes, making them feel considerate rather than final. Carefully worded concern replaced genuine accountability, offering reassurance without responsibility. Everything appeared thoughtful, even when it was not. Those operating within the system assumed that no one remembered. They relied on the natural turnover of people, on distraction, on the belief that moments left unchallenged dissolved on their own. Forgetting was not accidental. It was structural. The system depended on it to remain comfortable, to continue without scrutiny. Each repetition reinforced that dependency, strengthening the pattern simply by allowing it to continue unexamined. The grandson remained invisible by design. He did not draw attention to himself or interrupt the flow of daily operations. He met expectations, spoke when required, and blended seamlessly into the environment. His presence reassured those around him that everything was functioning as it should. No one suspected that observation itself could become a form of participation. His silence allowed the system to behave naturally, without caution or self-consciousness. Smiles circulated freely, effortless and automatic. They appeared at the beginning of conversations and lingered just long enough to signal goodwill. Concern was expressed with precision, phrased carefully to sound empathetic without opening the door to responsibility. These gestures were not cruel. They were habitual. Their effectiveness lay in how convincingly they replaced discomfort with reassurance, allowing everyone involved to feel resolved without addressing what lingered beneath the surface. What struck the grandson most was not cruelty, but certainty. The system did not believe it could be wrong. Its confidence rested on repetition, on the assumption that if something had worked before, it would continue to work indefinitely. Each unchallenged outcome became proof of legitimacy. The longer the pattern persisted, the more invisible it became, absorbed into routine and accepted as normal. He noticed how no one expected accountability because no one had ever been asked to provide it. Processes concluded cleanly, leaving no loose ends that required reflection. Files were closed. Decisions finalized. The calm efficiency of it all suggested resolution, even when nothing had been resolved at a human level. This disconnect felt deeply familiar, echoing the day his grandmother's dignity had been set aside without comment or acknowledgement. The repetition did not provoke anger in him. Instead, it deepened his understanding. He recognized now that systems rarely corrected themselves out of conscience. They adjusted only when their assumptions were interrupted. As long as forgetting remained intact, the system could continue confidently, believing each decision existed in isolation rather than as part of a pattern. Continuity was disguised as neutrality. He watched the pattern strengthen through use. Each time it repeated, it became easier to justify. Each smile reinforced the belief that everything had been handled properly. Each expression of concern reassured those involved that care had been taken, even when outcomes remained unchanged. The surface calm masked the absence of accountability beneath it, allowing the system to maintain its image without altering its behavior. The grandmother's experience returned to him with renewed clarity. Her silence had preserved her dignity, but it had also allowed the system to remain unaware. Not because she had failed to speak, but because the system had never learned to listen. It relied on forgetting not only from those it affected, but from itself. It moved forward without memory, confident that nothing would require reconsideration. The grandson understood now that awareness alone did not disrupt patterns. Observation without structure allowed repetition to continue unchecked. The system's confidence depended entirely on the belief that no one would connect past to present. That belief was its greatest vulnerability, though it did not know it. Comfort had made it blind. A quiet resolve settled in him, not as urgency, but as steadiness. There was no need to expose or confront prematurely. The system was revealing itself clearly enough through its own consistency. Each repetition added another layer of understanding, another point of reference. He allowed it to continue, knowing that interruption too early would only prompt surface adjustments rather than meaningful change. What sustained him was patience. He accepted that change did not arrive through disruption alone. It required timing, alignment, and the willingness to let patterns fully emerge. The system's confidence was not something to challenge directly. It was something to observe until it became undeniable, until its assumptions encountered their own limits. As he reviewed yet another familiar outcome, the realization settled fully. The system was not careless. It was comfortable. Its comfort came from the assumption that no one remembered long enough to notice repetition. That assumption shaped everything it did. In that understanding, the grandson recognized the truth at the center of all he had observed. The system did not fear opposition. It depended on forgetting. And for the first time, he understood that remembering was not merely an act of awareness. It was the quiet beginning of consequence. Waiting is often misunderstood because it does not announce its intention. To people who value speed, decisiveness, and visibility, waiting looks like hesitation. To systems accustomed to operating without resistance, it looks like compliance. Silence, in those contexts, is often mistaken for agreement. But the grandson understood something most people never consider. Acting too early would not challenge the structure he was observing. It would protect it. Early reaction would alert the system before it was ready to be examined, prompting surface-level adjustments that preserved the core behavior while appearing responsive. Silence, when chosen deliberately, offered something far stronger than reaction ever could. So he waited intentionally. This waiting was not passive, and it was never careless. It required discipline, patience, and a steady refusal to be provoked by incomplete understanding. Each day, he continued his responsibilities without deviation. He met expectations, respected timelines, and carried himself with quiet consistency. He remained unremarkable in ways that allowed him to stay unseen. The system had no reason to adjust its behavior around him, no cause to become cautious. His calm presence reassured those in authority that nothing required reconsideration. External pressure began to build, without his involvement. It did so slowly, the way institutional weight often does when patterns grow heavy enough to attract attention. Policies shifted slightly. Oversight increased in small, almost imperceptible increments. Reviews took longer than usual. Questions began appearing where answers had once been assumed. None of these changes announced themselves as meaningful on their own, but together they altered the environment. The grandson noticed these shifts immediately. He did not accelerate them or attempt to guide them. He observed quietly, trusting the process to reveal itself fully in its own time. Timing became critical. He understood that alignment mattered more than any single action he could take. Documentation needed the right moment to surface. Patterns required enough distance to become undeniable. Acting before that alignment would fracture the narrative, turning something systemic into something personal. He had no interest in personal confrontation or individual blame. What mattered was integrity, not recognition. The goal was not to be seen as right, but to allow truth to stand on its own. Silence remained intact throughout this period. He did not share his observations or hint at what he had noticed. There were no victory speeches waiting in his mind, no desire to be acknowledged for patience or restraint. He did not imagine himself as a catalyst or a hero. The work he was doing did not require an audience. It required consistency. The long game held precisely because it was not driven by urgency or ego. There were moments when waiting felt heavy. Watching familiar outcomes repeat stirred a quiet discomfort, the same feeling he had carried since childhood. Each repetition echoed something unresolved, something that asked for attention. But he resisted the impulse to intervene prematurely. He remembered his grandmother's restraint, the way she had preserved her dignity by not forcing recognition from those unwilling to offer it. That memory grounded him. It reminded him that endurance could be generous rather than bitter, that patience could protect truth rather than delay it. As time passed, the system began responding to pressures it did not fully understand. Adjustments occurred without explanation. Procedures tightened. Oversight expanded. Authority narrowed in subtle ways. None of these changes traced back to him directly, and that distance mattered. It ensured that any eventual correction would be attributed to process rather than protest. Accountability would emerge structurally, not emotionally. The system would encounter itself through its own mechanisms. Patience revealed its value gradually. Waiting allowed the system to behave naturally, exposing its assumptions through repetition. Each decision made without awareness added clarity. Each moment of unchecked confidence reinforced the pattern he had been documenting. The longer he waited, the more complete the picture became. This was not delay. It was preparation. It was the careful preservation of context, ensuring that when the moment arrived, nothing essential would be lost. He accepted uncertainty as part of the process. There was no guarantee that the outcome would align perfectly with expectation. He understood that control over timing did not extend to control over resolution. Letting go of that desire brought relief. The waiting became lighter once it was no longer tied to a specific result. What mattered was readiness, not outcome. Readiness ensured that whatever followed would be clean, not reactive. During this phase, the grandson found a quiet sense of grace. Guilt softened into acceptance. He no longer felt responsible for correcting the past in a visible or performative way. His role was simpler and more demanding than that. He needed to ensure that memory was preserved long enough to matter. That understanding allowed him to forgive without forgetting, to remain open without becoming exposed. Forgiveness did not erase responsibility. It released him from carrying resentment forward. No bragging accompanied his patience. There was nothing to claim and no one to convince. His silence was not strategic in a calculated sense. It was respectful. It honored the complexity of systems and the cost of premature disruption. The long game was not about winning. It was about allowing truth to surface intact, without being shaped by reaction or resistance. Then, without announcement, something shifted. A routine inquiry expanded beyond its usual scope. Documentation was requested through formal channels, not because he had offered it, but because the system had reached a point where it needed to examine itself. The request appeared ordinary, procedural, easy to overlook. But he recognized it immediately as the moment he had been waiting for. He did not feel triumph. There was no surge of emotion or sense of arrival. Instead, there was a calm acknowledgement, a quiet readiness. The timing had arrived not because he forced it, but because conditions had aligned naturally. Silence had done its work. Patience had held. He remained still, allowing the process to continue without interference. The long game reached its turning point not with noise or recognition, but with quiet inevitability. And in that stillness, he understood fully that waiting had never been weakness. It had been the most deliberate form of strength he possessed. The shift did not announce itself. There was no meeting called to explain it, no message sent to clarify what was changing or why. It arrived the way most institutional adjustments do, quietly and without attribution, folded into existing processes so smoothly that it appeared almost natural. From the outside, everything looked the same. Inside, however, direction had altered. The information the grandson had preserved did not move with urgency or emotion. It reached the proper channels as part of routine procedure, indistinguishable from other records until it was examined closely. That anonymity mattered. It allowed the process to unfold without defensiveness, without anyone needing to protect themselves from accusation. The documentation spoke only in dates, language, and repetition. It did not accuse. It did not explain. It simply existed. Once activated, the procedures followed their own logic. Reviews expanded. Comparisons were made across timelines. Decisions once treated as isolated were placed side by side, revealing consistency where none had been acknowledged before. The system encountered itself through its own records. There was no moment of confrontation, no single figure standing accused. Accountability emerged through alignment, not exposure. No apology was requested, and none was offered. The absence felt deliberate, almost necessary. An apology would have shifted attention toward intent and emotion, inviting negotiation where none was required. What occurred instead remained procedural. Adjustments were logged, responsibilities reassigned. Oversight increased in places where it had once been absent. These changes were not framed as punishment, but as correction. Authority adjusted quietly. Influence narrowed without explanation. Decisions that once passed through unquestioned now required additional review. The system did not collapse or recoil. It absorbed the correction the way it absorbed everything else, integrating change without commentary. To most people, nothing appeared different. The same smiles remained. The same expressions of concern continued. The surface calm held. The grandson observed from a distance, careful not to attach himself to the outcome. There was no satisfaction to claim and no resolution to perform. He felt no urge to speak or explain. The work had never been about recognition. It had been about allowing consequence to arrive cleanly, without being shaped by reaction or resentment. There was a quiet grace in how it unfolded. The grandmother's experience had not been publicly revisited or named. Her dignity had not required validation from the system that once dismissed it. Instead, the behavior that diminished her was rendered ineffective, unable to repeat itself with the same confidence. The correction honored her restraint without forcing it into narrative. Forgiveness settled differently now. It did not arrive as absolution or reconciliation. It arrived as release. The grandson felt a loosening of the weight he had carried, surprised by how gentle it felt. He realized that justice did not need to be loud to be complete. It needed to be sufficient. No drama followed. There were no reactions to manage, no fallout to address. The system continued operating, altered just enough to prevent repetition. Those affected by the changes would never know the full story, and that felt appropriate. The purpose had not been to teach a lesson, but to interrupt a pattern. The grandmother never learned the details. She did not need to. Her silence had not been an invitation to forget, but an act of trust in time. That trust had not been misplaced. The grandson understood now that her restraint had created space for a different kind of resolution, one that preserved her dignity without demanding acknowledgement from those unwilling to give it. As the process concluded, files were closed and reviews completed. Everything returned to routine, carrying its adjustments quietly forward. The system said nothing, and no one asked it to. The absence of explanation became part of the correction, reinforcing that some outcomes did not require public accounting to matter. The grandson allowed himself a moment of stillness. Not relief, not triumph, but acceptance. Guilt softened into grace. He felt connected to something larger than the original moment, something that extended beyond his role or intention. Memory had done its work, and documentation had given it form. The rest had unfolded on its own. He understood now that consequences did not always arrive with acknowledgement. Sometimes they arrived as quiet shifts, felt rather than announced. That understanding brought a sense of peace he had not anticipated. It allowed him to forgive without forgetting, to let go without denying what had happened. The system had changed. That much was clear. But it offered no explanation, no apology, no reflection. And perhaps that was the final lesson. Not all corrections come with recognition. Some simply alter the future in ways no one notices until repetition stops. As he moved forward, the grandson carried that knowledge with him, steady and unburdened. The past no longer demanded attention. It had been honored through consequence, not conversation. The system had spoken through action, not words. And in its silence, something essential had finally shifted. The grandmother never saw what changed. Her life reached its natural conclusion with the same quiet steadiness that had defined it for decades. There was no final conversation where the past was revisited or clarified. No moment when outcomes were explained or justice was outlined in careful terms. She passed without knowing that the system which once diminished her had quietly corrected itself, that a pattern which had relied on her silence had finally encountered limits. And yet, nothing about her life felt unfinished. The grandson understood this only after time granted him distance. In the beginning, the absence of shared closure felt like a missing page, something that might have brought comfort if it had been filled. He imagined, briefly and without urgency, what it would have been like to tell her everything. Not to seek approval or reassurance, but to offer her the knowledge that her restraint had mattered, that the silence she chose had not dissolved into nothing. But the longer he sat with that thought, the clearer it became that such an explanation was unnecessary. She had never lived for recognition. Her dignity had not depended on being seen, praised, or vindicated. It had been built quietly, through consistency, patience, and a disciplined acceptance of what could not be changed without surrendering self-respect. The grandson came to understand that telling her would not have completed her story. It might have reduced it, narrowing a life of principle into a single resolved moment. Her strength had never required an ending shaped by acknowledgement. He never sought recognition either. There was no part of him that wanted to be known for what had unfolded. Recognition would have shifted the focus away from what mattered most. This had never been about achievement, triumph, or moral superiority. It had been about care for memory, for restraint, for the belief that dignity could survive even when systems failed to honor it. Letting the outcome remain anonymous preserved that care in its purest form. Justice, as it arrived, existed without acknowledgement. It did not come wrapped in apology or explanation. It did not ask to be understood, accepted, or forgiven. It simply altered what came next. The repetition stopped. The confidence that once carried the pattern forward quietly eroded. What had continued unchecked now encountered boundaries it could not ignore. That was enough. The grandson felt no need to name it beyond that. Memory proved to be the quiet force behind everything. Not memory sharpened by anger or sustained by resentment, but memory held gently, without urgency. It prevented repetition not by demanding attention, but by outlasting indifference. The grandson understood now that forgetting was never neutral. It always favored the structure that caused harm. Remembering, even silently, disrupted that balance in ways that noise never could. Silence revealed its full meaning at last. It was not absence, and it was not surrender. It was control exercised without cruelty. Reaction might have brought temporary relief, but it would have required performance. Silence allowed truth to surface on its own terms, free from distortion. The restraint his grandmother modeled had not delayed resolution. It had protected it, preserving dignity while waiting for timing to do its work. A quiet forgiveness wove itself through this understanding. Not forgiveness that erased responsibility, and not forgiveness that demanded reconciliation. It was forgiveness rooted in acceptance, the acceptance that systems rarely offer remorse, and that healing does not depend on receiving it. Letting go of the need for acknowledgement freed the grandson from carrying resentment forward. Guilt softened into grace. The weight he had carried for years eased without ceremony. He began to notice how often the world rewarded noise. How quickly attention gathered around confrontation, spectacle, and public resolution. And yet, the most meaningful shift he had ever witnessed had occurred without any of those things. It had happened through patience, documentation, and timing. Through a willingness to wait. Through memory held steady until it could no longer be ignored. The grandmother's legacy settled into something clear and lasting. She had shown him that dignity did not require fairness to endure. That silence, when chosen deliberately, could be an act of strength rather than erasure. That restraint could win not by overpowering, but by outlasting. He carried that lesson forward, not as burden, but as inheritance, shaping how he moved through the world. In moments when he felt the pull to react quickly, to correct publicly, to demand recognition, he paused. He remembered how power moved most effectively when it remained unannounced. He remembered that change did not need to be loud to be real. That understanding shaped the way he listened, the way he observed, and the way he waited when others rushed to speak. The past no longer felt heavy. It felt instructive. What had once threatened to diminish a life had instead shaped a way of seeing the world that valued patience over performance and integrity over acknowledgement. The grandson felt gratitude for that, even knowing the path had been quiet and long. Humiliation, he now understood, survives only when people forget. It depends on speed, distraction, and the comfort of moving on without reflection. But change begins with the one who remembers, the one who notices, the one who waits without demanding credit. That truth remained with him, steady and complete. And in holding it, he honored his grandmother more fully than any explanation ever could.